Hello, this is Gene Stroll, welcoming you back to my rogues gallery of American presidents. We ended part one with the disastrous administration of Andrew Johnson just after Lincoln's assassination. We'll start this second part with Ulysses Grant, who followed Andrew Johnson in 1869. Well, look at this. Another general. A hero of the Civil War, Grant had no idea what was required of him as a civilian leader. He managed to sit back on his hefty haunches and let the newborn business party, calling itself the Republican Party, unravel all the Reconstruction progress which had begun at the end of Lincoln's violently aborted second term. This new party cared only about material progress at the cost of moral progress and planetary responsibility. That party has not changed in 150 years. Grant solidified Republican domination for half a century. Until the next century, there would not be another leader worth mentioning, and certainly not extolling. Names such as Hayes, Garfield, Arthur, Harrison, and McKinley are notable only in the not-so-benign role they played in fully transforming the Republican Party into the party of Mammon, and whose heroes are remembered today as the notorious robber barons, and who seem the robber barons who seem to be the role models for our current administration. All right, we'll move on now to James A. Garfield, 1881. Garfield was a rarity, a true scholar and a gentleman. He had been a Union Army hero in the Civil War, and he demonstrated great promise in his brief 6 months in office. He was potentially too good to really include in this gallery. He became the second president victimized by a bullet from a deranged assassin. 1897, William McKinley. Here is the third presidential victim of the nation's cherished Second Amendment. McKinley was the most difficult candidate for me to assess for this gallery. As a person, he had truly distinguished qualities. As a president, he had conflicting sides. This, indeed, was the heyday of the robber barons, and one of them, a man named Mark Hanna, who was the Elon Musk of his day, basically bought the 1896 election for McKinley. Oh, and by the way, a Senate seat for himself. These were the final days of a 5-year-long economic depression, and McKinley believed the best tonic for the recovering nation was high tariffs. All those tariffs managed to accomplish was to facilitate the out-of-control growth of corporations. By the time his first term was drawing to a close, McKinley finally recognized this and tried to reverse course, but it was rather late. His most ambivalent accomplishment in office was to shove America into its new unrequested role as a world power. This he did by manufacturing a phony war with Spain, a nation which controlled Cuba and Puerto Rico. In this rather underhanded effort, he was aided by a robber baron propagandist named William Randolph Hearst. At the end of the war, America now owned, quote unquote, Puerto Rico, and, by the way, the once Spanish Philippines, and controlled Cuba, which of course was later to become a mafia haven. He was assassinated, as I said, the third, in his first year of his second term, and was followed by Theodore Roosevelt, one of our most colorful presidents in the history of the nation. Roosevelt was another wannabe general, remember San Juan Hill, Teddy, as he was known, was also a historical rarity, a Republican reformer. In office, he behaved very unrepublican-like. He recognized the growing threat to our Commonwealth posed by unrestrained corporate power and became a, quote, trust buster. He appreciated the Earth's natural wonders and established the nation's magnificent national park system and kept it off limits to private interests. He would be ostracized by today's Republicans. He was also undoubtedly the most colorful of our presidents, kind of real-life version of Yosemite Sam. Followed by William H. Taft, 1909. And here we go back to reality, an unenlightened Republican again. At least Taft didn't lust after the presidency. He really wanted to be on the Supreme Court. But he did manage, while in office, to smother some of Teddy's better ideas. He was followed in 1913 by Woodrow Wilson for 2 terms. Wilson was one of the most educated and racist presidents to inhabit the White House. In those years, it didn't seem to matter whether you were a Republican or a Democrat. You were a racist. He had managed to get his dour, colorless, appropriate, right? His colorless self into the White House by swearing to the American public that he would keep us out of the swampy morass in Europe, known, ironically, as the Great War. He did keep that promise, but only for the first 3 years. He was followed by what I call the jazz and graft decade, the 1920s. Popularly known as the jazz decade, but it's actually the jazz and graft decade. Beginning with James Buchanan, very briefly, and on to Warren G. Harding. 1921 for Buchanan, only 1 year, and 21 to 23 for Harding. I have labeled them the Tweedledee and Tweedledum, establishment clones of Al Capone. I don't really have much more to tell you about them except to describe them as meek, mild-mannered, outwardly proper incarnations of Scarface. They probably made the mafia envious. They literally, and no argument here, looted the U.S. Treasury for most of that decade and helped the robber baron crowd lead us into the Great Depression. Calvin Coolidge, 2 terms starting in 1923. Coolidge I call the Cheshire Cat of this gallery. For the American public, Coolidge was just a face. Even though this was the heyday of radio, and nearly everyone had one, you would have had a greater chance of being struck by lightning than of ever hearing Coolidge speak, and probably would have been luckier. He was followed by one of the most disastrous presidents in our history, and there have been more than one, Herbert Hoover, 1929, 1 term. He was the phoenix of this gallery. He was private, reclusive, withdrawn, and lacking affect and empathy. His obsessive worship of capitalism blinded him to capitalism's disastrous abuses and failings, a blindness which led directly to the most miserable, downtrodden decade for Americans in the nation's history. He is, truly, capitalism's poster child. Indeed, today's Hoover Institute proudly bears his name. Oh, here comes, finally, a much-needed breath of fresh air. Starting in 1933, 4 terms of Franklin D. Roosevelt. The closest we've come since Washington to actually having a king. FDR, as he was known by the public, miraculously managed to save America's mortally wounded capitalism by breaking through its irrational, self-destructive mental block against socialism and borrowing socialism's precepts about a social safety net. He single-handedly, almost unrelentingly, against against very unrelenting Republican resistance, guided America out of the Middle Ages and into the 20th century. Our present Social Security system is his handiwork. If he stayed with us longer, we would probably have a Medicare for all system today. FDR, as I said, won 4 consecutive elections. Only his health proved to be his undoing. He unfortunately appeared on the scene too late to be carved into Mount Rushmore. In case you're wondering why he's included belatedly in our list, it's because FDR demonstrated 2 serious failings during his time on the throne. First, he delayed far too long to take decisive action against Germany, while Germany was gobbling up Europe and while Germany was becoming more and more genocidal. And secondly, he allowed the American military, with the blessing of the Supreme Court, to strip Japanese American citizens of their rights and to be removed forcibly from their homes and sent into what can only be described as proto-concentration camps. American paranoia was quite rampant at the time, and FDR did nothing to rein it in. Now, at the beginning, way back at the beginning, of the Great Depression, FDR had calmed the nation by telling them, we have nothing to fear but fear itself. In 1942, 10 years later, he could have counseled them again regarding Japanese Americans by saying, we have nothing to fear but our own paranoia. He did not, and that remains the biggest stain on his presidency. Nevertheless, FDR, along with the obvious choices of Lincoln and Washington, still deserves a place on Mount Rushmore. That is, before it's blasted to rubble by our current pretender, D. Trump, in a fit of pique. He was followed by Harry S. Truman in 1945. Now, unfortunately, following in Lincoln's footsteps, FDR had managed to find another Southerner to pick out of a hat, or in this case, a hat store. Truman was a haberdasher. He did it to mollify the Southern voting bloc. Truman is remembered today primarily as the only world leader to, so far at least, ever order nuclear weapons dropped on major cities. You know, there's still a simmering debate as to whether this was absolutely necessary. Japan's military, after all, was already crumbling, and Japan was scared stiff when Russia entered the conflict in the Far East. The only short-term good this act accomplished was to give humanity a vivid demonstration of the nightmarish threat it was to now and perhaps forever live under. Truman was followed in 1953 by Dwight Eisenhower. 2 terms. Eisenhower was another of those military heroes promoted to the White House. Ike was rock solid, perhaps a bit too rock solid. He made no major blunders, and indeed was the first president to actually use America's military to intervene humanely and subdue rampant Southern violence. He was, however, too cautious to intervene against the flagrant violence against America's capitalist system being perpetrated by what he would finally, at the very end of his terms in office, in his farewell address, correctly label the, quote, military-industrial complex. That complex would go on to drain and disfigure America's economy for the next half-century. And by the way, it still hasn't gone away. It just must now share that devouring appetite with the Silicon Valley industrial complex.